Hello, everyone. This is Melissa Lentz. I'm the Director of Education at OCEG, and I'd like to welcome you to our webcast today, during which we will present how to decode third-party SOC 2 reports. We are glad you can join us for this event. Instead of completing a full standards-based risk assessment, some vendors simply submit their most recent SOC 2 report. However, for organizations that lack the expertise and resources, interpreting these SOC 2 reports can be complex and time-consuming, not to mention inconsistent with how other vendors are assessed. How do you simplify the process of analyzing SOC 2 reports and get what you need to visualize important vendor risks? We are glad you can join us as we discuss how to analyze the effectiveness of a vendor's security controls consistently with the rest of your third-party estate. For our discussion today, we are joined by our speaker, Thomas Humphreys, compliance expert and content manager with Prevalent. We are very pleased to be joined by Thomas as he shares his insight on analyzing the effectiveness of a vendor's security controls and how to decode third-party SOC 2 reports. But before we start, I'd like to take a minute to go over a few housekeeping notes. First, regarding continuing education credit. We provide NASBA-approved CPE credit to you for participation in live webinars. If you have an OCEG All Access Pass, which you can purchase individually or as part of a company subscription. The All Access Pass includes many benefits in addition to CPE credit for webcasts, such as access to all OCEG resources and on-demand education series. So if you don't already have a pass, I would encourage you to check it out on the OCEG site. If you do have an All Access Pass and would like a certificate of completion for CPE for this event, please be sure to stay with us for the entire hour and to answer all the polls. These are requirements for receiving CPE credit for this event. And please note, certificates of completion for CPE credit are available only for live events. They are not available for viewing archived webinars. Second, regarding the recording from this webcast, we will have the recording of this event posted on the OCEG website. Just log into the site, then go to the Webinars tab and select Past Webinar Recordings and then this webcast. This recording may be viewed by anyone for about 1 week, and after this time, the recording may be viewed by anyone with an All Access Pass. Third, regarding upcoming events and activities, please watch your email for announcements from OCEG about other upcoming webinars. You can view information about these upcoming webcasts on the OCEG site. So today we will address the following learning objectives. We will learn how to deconstruct a typical SOC 2 report, including the 5 trust services principles, explain how to map SOC 2 report control exceptions into risks in a common vendor risk and security framework, describe best practices to remediate a vendor's SOC 2 control deficiencies, and determine how to create an agile, integrated, and tech-driven compliance program. But before we hand over the presentation to our speaker, we'd like to offer our first poll. And again, please be sure to answer this poll if you are interested in receiving CPE credit for this event. The first poll question is, do you have an OCEG All Access Pass, which is a paid membership, and would you like to receive CPE credit for this event? Your options here are, yes, I have an All Access Pass, and I would like to receive a CPE certificate of completion for this event. I have an All Access Pass, but I don't need a CPE certificate of completion. No, I do not have an All Access Pass, but I would like to get one and receive CPE credit for this and future webcasts I attend. Or no, I do not have an All Access Pass and I don't want to buy one at this time, so I won't receive CPE credit for this event. As you are answering this poll, I'd like to hand over the presentation to Thomas to begin our discussion today.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. My name is Thomas Humphreys. I'm the content manager at Prevalent. I work to build various assessments and frameworks built on many standards, not least including SOC 2. And as indicated, I'm here today to really get to grips with understanding what a SOC 2 report is all about and being able to digest the pertinent topics and aspects that will enable us to help understand risks and exceptions in the reports and how to ingrain them into our wider risk management, third-party risk management program. So let's make a start with an introduction to SOC 2 assessments. So SOC, or System and Organization Controls, is a set of frameworks that enables organizations to demonstrate security, and in some cases privacy controls, against their own operations, systems, information, and the effectiveness of those controls. SOC reports are reports that are provided by independent bodies, independent auditing bodies, and they can be split up into two types, type 1 and type 2. A type 1 SOC report is a report that's delivered at a moment in time by an auditor, and the focus is very much on the design of controls. You often find that organizations who are going for SOC for the first time will typically start with a type 1 report, because it gives confidence to develop and demonstrate that controls have been designed appropriately, policies, processes, and control groups have been established. Type 2 reports are longer, they're more extensive, and they provide more detail, both to the auditor and to the organization being audited, but also to their wider audience, customers, regulators, anyone else who may receive or request a SOC report. The purpose of the type 2 is very much looking at the operational effectiveness of the controls, and as such is delivered over a longer period, typically up to 6 months. The purpose of which, of course, being that an auditor viewing the controls needs to have confidence and to make sure that those controls that have been designed are effectively working. And more often than not, you need a reasonable time frame in order to do that. So, for example, where an organization has designed controls around change management, incident management, and capacity planning, they need to be able to dig into the details of existing changes and how changes are being managed, for example, or how capacity is affecting systems. And so that's very much the purpose of the type 1 or the type 2 report. So the design effectiveness and the operational effectiveness. So they're delivered by independent auditors and auditing bodies who have been certified to carry out such assessments. When it comes to SOC itself, there's a lot of structure around it based on 5 key control groups, what are termed the trust service criteria. And this is criteria that we'll touch on later on. These set out a series of controls, not too dissimilar to other recognized standards and frameworks. Anyone familiar with ISO 27000, for example, or NIST, or ISF, other information security or cybersecurity frameworks, will recognize some commonality here with the type of controls that are being identified and being assessed. So there's a series of control groups that the auditors use to validate against the organization. But it's important to note at this time, and as we'll see later on through the webinar, that it's not always necessary for every control group to be assessed against a particular organization. When it comes to scoping out your assessment, SOC 2 allows organizations to very much tailor the assessment based on their product and service delivery. And as we'll see, there are some control groups that organizations deem not applicable to the business, whether that's logically based on the nature of the product and service they're looking at, or whether there are other factors that drive the scope and ring fencing the scope of assessment. So SOC 2 is a structured approach that sets a framework for enabling organizations to demonstrate best practices in information security, cybersecurity, and in some cases privacy, which more often than not is used and delivered to their wider client base and other external stakeholders. So it's important now to perhaps take a wider look at the concept of the SOC 2 report itself. So I've already mentioned that there are 2 types of reports, and that there are assessed and delivered by independent auditors. However, one of the key areas that we need to make clear and that may become apparent the more SOC 2 reports that you receive is that they can look very, very different. Depends on the auditing body, the way they structure the SOC report can be structured in a slightly different way. And this can cause confusion at some times to say, well, if we're receiving 2 reports, we still need to get the same detail around, does the scope match the service delivery that this vendor is providing to us? Are we able to ascertain whether there are any exceptions or non-conformities that we need to pay close attention to? However, despite the difference in the design and the layout of each SOC report, there are typically 5 areas that every report will contain. Some will be more detailed than others, but they should still have these 5 areas. And if we understand what these 5 areas are, and you're able to identify them within a report, it makes it so much easier trying to get to grips with, should we be concerned with this organization based on perceived risks or known risks, or is it a clean bill of health with the best practice standards that they've implemented? So on the left-hand side of the screen, you should see 5 bullets: the auditor summary, an overview of organizational operations, processes, and systems, scope of the report and the trust service criteria, control activities and auditor validation, and management response. On the right-hand side, we have a sample table of contents showing some of the pertinent areas that we'll see in a SOC 2 Type 2 report. So when it comes to the auditor summary, what are we looking at here? So like many reports, you'll typically find a high-level, almost executive summary, if you will, that sets the scene for the wider report. And this is where the auditor presents a summary of the results, an overview of their assessment methodology. They may include aspects around exceptions that they've identified. In some instances, they already report on the specific scope of the SOC 2, so the aspects of the trust criteria that they have assessed the organization against. So it gives a very executive high-level overview of what's happened and the overall performance of the organization when they've been assessed. Moving on to the overview of organizational operations, processes, and systems, it's worth highlighting section 3, just to underline the extent and the depth that this section can go to. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of sub-controls, sub-clauses here, covering quite a large volume of the report. And the purpose here is to really go into detail of what processes, the interlink between processes, what systems a company uses and operates with, and how those processes and systems interact with each other. So this could be high level from a company background perspective, giving an overview of what the organization does. So the products and services it supplies, maybe the geographies that the organization operates in. Then down to some of the more granular detail around core processes that they use. So risk assessment processes that enable monitoring, information and communication processes, the control environment itself. We can now then go down into a bit more depth around some of the technical capability of the organization. So if they use SIEM systems for event monitoring, if they have vulnerability assessments and penetration testing, and if they conduct information backup and the type of backup systems that they utilize. So it can be quite overwhelming at first when you see this volume of information, because it really can go into a lot of depth. And some independent auditing bodies do choose to go to that level of depth. And that represents, in some cases, the complexity of the organization. Why is this important? Well, obviously, when we receive a report from a vendor, one of the key things we need to make sure is that the scope that's been assessed against ties in or aligns to the scope of service that the third party is providing to us, the type of product and service delivery. If the scope actually falls outside and is very much ring-fenced for a different part of the operations, rather than what this third party is providing to us, it then presents a completely different slant on how we interact with that third party, particularly if there are systems that we know have not been covered, have not been assessed for the security controls or privacy controls, for example. If it isn't already mentioned within the auditor summary, there will be a section that touches on the scope of the report. And this is one of the most important parts to identify first off, because this will detail the exact control groups that have been assessed through the auditor. So as we see shortly, there are 5 control groups, and at this stage we'll have an idea of whether all 5 have been identified, whether one has been assessed, or multiple in between. Moving on then to the control activities and auditor validation. This is where we then get into the detail of those controls, and we start to identify what the control is, how the company has responded or used that control, and then the auditor's response. So their view and their analysis of the controls, and if there are any exceptions or not that are captured as well. If there are exceptions, and I'll explain later on what an exception is, there then will be some form of management response in the report as well. And this is quite critical, because when we're looking through the control activities, and if we're counting and identifying where exceptions have been identified, at this stage, it may already be a control that has been managed, because through the management response, it's the organization's ability and chance to explain whether there already is an action plan in place to address the findings that have been raised. It may be that there's further clarification, such that a control that maybe have deemed an exception and is not visible has actually been captured elsewhere. So it's a good point and chance from the management side to either recognize and put in place, put on record the approach that the organization is going to take, or validation and verification of controls and activities that have already been put in place. So once we receive a new SOC report, if we can already identify these 5 areas from the summary through to control activities, scope, and any responses, it should already put us in a much better position to get to the heart of what's been captured and covered, and are there any risks or not that we need to be mindful of. So I've mentioned the 5 trust service criteria multiple times, and I've highlighted that organizations are able to scope based on these trust criteria. So we have 5 key groups: security, confidentiality, processing integrity, availability, and privacy. So what are these 5 groups? So as I mentioned, in a similar vein to the likes of ISO and NIST, these are top-level groups under which are a series of controls that organizations then are assessed against. So let's go through each one. So from security, we're looking at controls to protect against unauthorized access, unauthorized disclosure of information, and damage to systems. So almost all SOC 2 reports will have security under their scope, although it is up for organizations to determine which control groups they want to cover, and in discussion with the auditors and auditing body. More often than not, we find that security, being the largest control group, is also the one that's covered the most. So what type of controls are we looking at here? So protecting against unauthorized access, disclosure of information, and damage to systems. So we're looking at everything from logical and physical access to data encryption and backup, to some governance controls, setting roles and responsibilities, risk management frameworks, and other similar physical and logical controls. So it's very technology heavy. There's very security driven, but having a grouping between sort of governance side and technical side. Confidentiality, controls for protecting information designed or identified as confidential. And at this stage, I'll also bring in the last control group, privacy, as well, because there's a subtle difference between the two. Privacy, as you'd expect, the focus very much is on personal data. So thinking of PII, SPII, any sensitive personal data, medical data, any of that data that's deemed personal. Very much the focus is on controls to protect against how that's secured, how that's handled, having data control officers, for example, in place, and responses for data breach management. Confidentiality, however, is focused more on information that's not deemed personal data, that may be company confidential. So this could be proprietary information, this could be intellectual property, this could be other information or information systems that are classified under the banner of confidentiality. And so the controls here are focused on the protection of that confidential information. So protection from destruction, protection in terms of the way it's being handled and where it's being stored. So there's a subtle difference there, but there's a clear distinction for companies that choose that control group. We then move on to processing integrity and availability. So integrity, and again, there's anyone from an ISO mindset will recognize these terms. So the quality assurance arm of data. So ensuring the system processing is accurate, is timely, and is valid. Availability, information and systems are made available and accessible at all time. So from a processing integrity perspective, making sure that the way the data is being processed, data that's being transferred, there's nothing that interrupts and disrupts the way the data is structured, for example. Whereas availability, need to make sure that the data is available at all times and is accessible to those who need to have access to it. So some access controls are very much the order of the day when it comes to establishing availability control groups. That's key to reiterate here that it's the organization who identifies the scope. And it begs the question, well, why not capture all scopes? Why not all 5 groups? Is it not the case that every company should adhere to security through to privacy? And the answer is no, of course, it's very much up to them. And there's various reasons behind this. So on the one side, when an organization sets out to achieve SOC 2 accreditation or attestation, it needs to look at where do these controls fit within its organization. So if, for example, based on the product and service provision of the business, they don't interact with or handle personal data in any capacity, it only seems right that the privacy control groups are not relevant. Likewise, if they're handling systems that are sensitive, that are capturing client confidential information, maybe they're providing those systems, but also inputting that information on behalf of the client, again, it only seems right that the confidentiality control group should be included. And so it very much depends on the scope of what the business operates under, the scope of what they're performing. But it's also important to think about scoping in terms of the areas it needs to go for SOC 2 accreditation for. If under contract, for example, there's a need to call out and to receive SOC 2 attestation, it may be very much ring-fenced due to a particular type of product or service. And through that determination of ring-fencing that part of the business, rather than being all-encompassing, that in itself may identify the best control groups that need to be captured and assessed by auditors. So before we move on, just have a second poll question here. Are you looking to augment or establish a third-party risk program in the coming months? We can answer yes, no, or I'm not too sure. Okay, so are you looking to augment or establish for the first time a third-party risk program across the coming months? So for now, move on to take a look at exceptions and what does an exception mean in the concept of SOC 2, but also thinking about how you manage risks and how you interact with your third-party program. So on the screen here, we can see a sample of criteria taken from a SOC report that captures a particular control. In this case, looking at CC 3.4, which comes from the trust service criteria. And we can see a breakdown of what the criteria is, so what the organization is required to do, the organization's response, so what controls, what policies, what processes they've implemented to meet that criteria, then the testing from the auditor themselves. So what validation, verification techniques, what tests, what inspections or interviews have they carried out to make sure what the organization has said matches the criteria, and then final results from the auditor. So in the first case, if you look at the control activity, so the company identifies and assesses changes that could significantly impact the system of internal control. And if the organization has stated that, well, changes to the business structure and operations are considered and evaluated as part of an annual risk assessment. So the organization considers business and operational change as part of its wider risk assessment program and risk registers. So given this is what the organization has said, we can see the assessors now inspected the risk assessment worksheets. They've looked at the most recent risk reviews and risk assessments. And they've aimed to verify that any change to business structure and or operations have been considered and evaluated. In this first instance, we note an exception. So there's a lack of visibility for identifying business structure or operational change as part of the annual risk assessment. So in this case, the auditor has gone in, it's reviewed the risk documentation, it's taken into consideration the activities the organization has specified, but they have been unable to find anything that validates the organization's statements. Versus the first result, as you can see, no exceptions have noted. So they've again inspected the risk assessment, they've inspected the requirement, in this case, change to regulatory or economic or physical environments, and they've seen evidence to suggest that there is no further exceptions noted. There's no issues to be raised on non-conformities. Secondly, we look at a different control here, where the organization has built a security incident analysis that's performed for any critical incidents in order to determine root cause, impact, and identify and reach some form of a resolution. And again, we can see the auditor has indicated that upon inspection of security or critical security incidents, there has been no root cause, no system impact or resolution that's been documented. So we've got a clear example of an organization stating, here's our working process, this is what we do, and this is the steps that we need to take. But now we've got evidence to show that those steps have not been taken. Now, one of the key things that's important to note here that can be perceived as missing versus other assessments and assessment types is outside of the exception that's noted, there's no indication of how severe this is. We have a statement and we have an exception. We haven't got any other indication of, are these mission critical? Are these what you might call critical, high, medium, or low risks, or red risks, whatever the methodology is to define that exception? And that's important to note within SOC 2 assessments. We can find and hopefully get to a stage where you can consolidate a list of different exceptions, if there are any that the auditor has identified. But we can't go to the level of, do we consider this, has the auditor considered this to be a critical risk? And this is where bringing them into our own risk program can help to set that expectation, help to define that. There are cases, of course, when we see in SOC 2 reports where there are no exceptions noted, what you might call a clean bill of health. The auditor has gone in and it hasn't identified any controls where it hasn't been designed effectively or the operational effectiveness is sound. The control has demonstrated and achieved what it set out to do. Lastly, before we move on, looking at the test results themselves, because this information is coming straight from the auditor, we'll always see a slightly different variance in the way test results are reported. So there's no strict hard or fast rule in terms of the level of detail that the auditor goes in. In these cases, it's quite clear on what they've seen or what they've not seen, based on the organization's controls, what they've stated they have. There will be some instances where you'll have less information. Obviously, the more information that's detailed in terms of the type of inspection and verification processes, the more detail in terms of the test result, obviously the easier it's going to make the process to bring these exceptions across to our wider risk program, and then when we start to engage with the third party. So when we think about mapping these exceptions across to our own risk platform, our own risk processes, firstly, we need to think about that level of detail. So where there's enough detail from what the auditors provided in the report, where there's management responses, and perhaps they've given further detail in terms of what aspects of the result they have achieved. If the company, for example, already says, understand, moving forward, we've adjusted our process to make sure that the necessary detail is captured as part of the incident tickets, and maybe there's some mandatory elements that we've added in, checks to enforce that level of detail. That will only help to aid our process when it comes to taking those exceptions and building them in within our risk process. So when we say mapping exceptions to risks, what do we mean? So because there hasn't been enough detail from the auditor in terms of, is it a critical high, medium or low risk or exception, or any indication of impact scores, likelihood scores, some of the standard terminology you'd expect in risk management, that's where we look to leverage our own existing risk tools and risk management processes. See if we have a process that follows best practices, such as ISO 31000 or the NIST risk management framework, we may already have a clear structure in how we identify an impact score and a likelihood score and give an overall risk rating. Or we use a traffic light system to indicate the criticality. So if we already have those tools established, it'll then make it easier to take those risks and say, well, based on what the auditor has said, based on the exception that's noted, do we deem this a critical risk or a low risk, for example? And of course, the more established that risk management tool is, then obviously the more comprehensive we can go into that detail around justifying why we've raised and calculated the risk in the way we have. One aspect where we do find SOC 2 reports being requested is where organizations send out assessments to third parties, assessments or surveys related to a particular control group. So for example, or standard and best practice. So in the event, for example, that we see ISO 27001 or CIS surveys being sent out to organizations, and then a SOC 2 report being received back because the vendor says, we don't have time to fill out a lengthy assessment, or before we send out, we fill out your assessment. We have this SOC 2 report that demonstrates the best practices that we've implemented, and we believe this is sufficient before we proceed with completing an assessment. So if there's already a clear structure there in terms of expectation that 27001 or CIS or other frameworks should be used to assess vendors, when we bring in the exceptions, such as the two above, as we've seen, we can already start to map these to those standards. And so if we consider, for example, a lack of root cause analysis, a poor security incident management process, poor security incident ticketing as a critical risk, because it's deemed a mandatory control in our ISO assessment or our CIS assessment, that'll help us to judge and to provide a clear statement as to why that risk is listed as critical, for example, or high or medium. So leveraging those existing risk tools, risk management tools you may have, identifying the impact and likelihood so we can assign some reasonable risk scores, again, taking into account any existing management response that may already come from the organization. And then finally, we can start to assign those tasks that are related to managing the assessment. So in the case where exceptions have been raised, have been identified, however, there has been no management response, or management have simply identified that, yes, we'll take action to resolve it. We need to start thinking about, we've now brought these exceptions into our platform, how do we now engage with our vendors to make sure that those actions, those risks or non-conformities are managed effectively, are closed off. So turning exceptions into risks. So once we've got the idea of the risk, we've identified the calculation and the level or risk rating that we want to apply. We can then start to look at other aspects to help us bulk out the exception and to get a wider case that's going to help make that process of engaging with the third party so much easier. So firstly, can we map it to standards that that are key to us? So I gave the example of ISO 27000. If there are clear controls already within that standard that we can map that exception to, it'll make it easier when we start to engage and identify some of the recommendations or remediation steps. Are there existing risk types in our own risk register that we can apply this risk to? So can we apply tags and risk types around incident management, around particular SOC 2 controls, if we've done that type of mapping? Do we have a standard risk register that we can carry all these risks into, so that when we start to receive more SOC 2 reports, we can start to do more trend analysis and overall viewpoints, particularly when there are similar risks and exceptions that are occurring. Developing the risk itself. So can we apply a risk name, a description, and risk ownership? So if we've seen the risk from the exception from the auditor, is there enough information for us to determine why it was a risk? Is it a clear process gap, for example? Is there a particular aspect of the control that was missing? So can we start to bulk out the description and understanding of where this risk has come from, where it was established? And then risk ownership as well, of course. Is there a particular function within the business that we need to reach out to? Who do we need to start having those discussions with to work out timeframes for setting risk remediation? So turning that exception into a wider risk in your platform goes through several steps. But as I mentioned at the start, a lot of this can depend on the level of depth that's seen through the SOC 2 report. There can, of course, be some instances where there's not as much detail captured by the auditor. Obviously, we can't go back and speak to the auditors. It's something that's independent. And of course, the report has already been published and completed. But obviously, if there's insufficient information, we can still start to capture some of that detail. But that's when we need to then engage the third party, perhaps at an earlier stage, so we can get more detail to understand where the actions come from, what are the ongoing activities, so we can start to fill out our own risk register, our own third party risk process with the pertinent detail around how and why it was established and what are the current steps the organization is taking. Before we move on, got the third poll question. So what prompted you to join this webinar today? Is it educational purposes? So purely for educational experience and just understanding more about SOC 2? Project research. I have an upcoming TPRM project. Perhaps you've already started your TPRM program and you've identified that SOC 2 is an area where you're going to see a lot of traction or perhaps you're requesting SOC 2 assessments from your vendors, or you're using that as the key driver to assess vendors against. I'm not sure why I'm here. Where am I again? So there should be a poll that's flashed up on the screen. So if you're able to enter in your appropriate response. Thank you. So we've got to the stage where we've established the SOC 2 report, we've received it, we've understood the detail, the exceptions, and the scope. We've identified that the scope matches what the product or service is being supplied to us by the vendor. We've identified now that the exceptions have been captured, and we've got to a stage where we're recording them within our own risk register, and hopefully with sufficient detail that we can now start engaging with the third party. Now it comes on to the remediation. So what do we do now? We've got these actions where there may or may not be some form of management response. So we should start now developing a playbook that enables us to remediate those SOC 2 exceptions. So we've got 4 key decisions to make and 3 actions to consider. So firstly, minimum or mandatory requirements. So are there any mandatory requirements from the business? So what do we mean by this? So I mentioned that from the outset, there may be some security assessments that you've already launched or that you're considering launching to the vendor. You already have a feel for what the vendor does, what it supplies to yourself. And through that process, have you identified any mandatory controls that you would expect an organization to have in place by default? So thinking about that exception around insufficient or poor quality in terms of incident response and the way incidents are recorded or the way they're not recorded. If you see this as a best practice that every organization should be implementing, this may be considered a mandatory requirement. And so that provides extra emphasis on the way it's remediated or the time in which it's remediated. Are there any best practices the organization is following? Are there any industry standards, whether coming down from regulators and legislation or coming from industry best practice, or even the owner organization has decided that these are the areas that it wants to follow? If there are best practices, such as ISOs and NISTs of the world and SIG in the United States, can that help lend a hand in terms of identifying those mandatory requirements and also what's required? What type of remediation is necessary? Timeframes are critical here. How soon should the risk be addressed? If through our risk identification process, we've identified that those exceptions we classify as critical risks, particularly where they are still open and management response to them has been, we're still addressing them or we're still reviewing those exceptions, we need to start thinking about, well, what time frame should we be setting on the third parties, both from perhaps an immediate response to state what actions they will be taking, and then a follow-up time frame of when they expect controls to be implemented or adjusted or updated. So how soon do we expect those risks to be addressed? And then finally, decisions or resulting actions. So what happens to remediated risks? What's the point and stage that we get to where we can say, we've identified the exception, we've classified it from a risk perspective, we've engaged the third party, and we've stated what we expect to happen, or there's been agreement between the third party and us in terms of what mitigating actions are required. What's the final decision point? Can we reach a stage based on our own risk appetite and criteria for risk acceptance, where we can close the risk down, or we can lower it to a suitable or an appropriate level? So when you're thinking about remediating vulnerability, there's a few different key points that we should be looking at here. And once we've stated and identified what the best practices are, if it's a mandatory control, and if there are any clear steps that we'd expect a third party to undertake, these requirements or expected remediation can then be enveloped within the wider risk report, and obviously communicated as appropriate to the third party. So in this case, thinking about a lack of root cause, system impact, or resolution that's documented across security incident tickets, we may develop a remediation that states we require vendors to identify the impact caused to business operations. It needs to be documented, the root cause of incidents and actions taken to resolve. And there should be clear visibility within every incident ticket or record produced that shows what actions are being taken. And then finally, perhaps we need them to embellish or enhance the method of how incident tickets are communicated and completed. So communication, staff awareness for those who are responsible for managing incidents. So we've thought about where perhaps where the root cause of this issue lies, and we've identified a suitable recommendation or remediation plan, which you can then pass on to the third party. And then upon agreement between both organizations, we can now start to monitor that remediation all the way through to either successful completion or to a stage where we feel this risk from a scoring perspective can either be lowered or the risk itself can be removed because sufficient information has been implemented by the third party such that this risk no longer exists. So we captured quite a lot of detail there across detailing what a SOC 2 report is and some of the key steps we need to look at. And there's a few areas I'd like to reiterate here, particularly those who are just starting out with a third-party risk management program and those who are particularly either starting to receive or will be expecting to receive SOC 2 reports. So firstly, from a risk management perspective, so assess your third-party risk management requirements. So determine where those best practices are required and where standards are being followed. Do we already have a clear approach, a clear security assessment, security framework that we're launching out to third parties or that we're auditing third parties against? If there are, have you got any suitable mapping across to those standards, such that when you receive a SOC 2 report, we've got some clear guidance in terms of, do these exceptions that may be raised, do they fit with our information security assessment? Determine minimum requirements. Are the mandatory controls that you would expect all third parties to carry out or to have in place? Are these controls driven by those best practice standards? Maybe they're driven across the industry or from regulators, just based on what's happening within the industry. And this actually becomes a very cyclical approach. So you're continually reviewing, do those best practices meet our aims and needs of assessing our third parties? Are we using the right standards? Are we using the right controls? Do those minimum requirements or mandatory controls that we've identified from the outset, do they still remain true? Or do we need to adjust and identify additional controls that we'd expect our vendors to adhere to? And then finally, can we map these to SOC 2 requirements from the trust criteria? And then once we've done this, we're then looking at the actual assessment of the SOC 2 reports itself. So once you receive that SOC 2 report, through the report, we identify what the scope has, the scope that's been used, and where exceptions are noted. Does the scope meet our expectation of what is being supplied by the third party? Has the auditor provided indication of where there are exceptions to the rule, where exceptions have been identified, and where there are gaps in processes and policies and systems? Once you've identified that, can we get to a stage where you can extract those exceptions and put them into our third-party risk program? So we capture them within risk reports within each vendor's risk profile, so that we're able to align them to the way we calculate risk. And then finally, make sure you have that process in place that manages those exceptions to ensure correct outcome, correct risk treatment, and a successful result is obtained through risk remediation and then through that level of engagement with the third party. It's also worth noting, just finally, from a SOC 2 report, I mentioned at the beginning that there will always be some occasions where no exceptions are noted. So the auditor has gone in, it's reviewed to one or multiple control groups, and it's a complete clean bill of health. We do see this particularly with some of the larger organizations, particularly where SOC 2 has been conducted year by year by year. So it's become quite a mature process. And that's not to say that the report then is no longer valuable. It then obviously provides a different route in how we use that information with our TPRM. But certainly that's a very positive outcome that we can use to perhaps demonstrate and identify best practices that some of these organizations are taking, particularly if we want to then see where there is trends analysis between similar vendors that are providing us with SOC reports. Just finally, just to note from Prevalent's perspective, so Prevalent has developed a SOC 2 and third-party risk management checklist, which discusses those trust service principles, maps the TPRM capabilities, but also how to simplify compliance reporting. This is something that's readily available and free to download through the link that you see on the page. So that concludes my webinar, and I now would like to open up and take a look at any questions. So, okay, so we have a couple of questions that are starting to come in. Does the SOC auditor follow up with a firm through mediation for any exceptions, any control exceptions noted? Does the SOC auditor follow up with a firm through mediation for any control exceptions noted? Good question. Now, as we've already identified, the SOC auditor will provide this detailed report and it'll provide a list of exceptions. Now, on the typical case, on the typical case, the SOC 2 reports will be conducted once, but then they'll be repeated on an annual basis. It's common to see companies being reviewed and assessed on an annual by annual basis. There is a potential to be assessed more frequently if the business wishes, or if as part of contractual agreements. And of course, during that time and that process, yes, the SOC auditor would follow up with the organization to identify, based on exceptions noted last time, where the improvements have been made based on the management responses, and any information that the management have committed to improving practices, whether they have been followed through and are complete. And as part of that year by year basis, the SOC auditor will, yes, then look at those findings, and particularly with a view to what's changed in the coming years, or whether there's been any improvements, particularly if you're getting quite a lot of exceptions in a particular area. It may be pertinent for the SOC assessor to dig deeper in that particular area when they're scoping out their report. This is a typical scenario you do find if there's a particular issue in a control group. So, for example, if we're looking at the security control group and there's a series of access control requirements, and there's a continuation of exceptions that have been raised, it may be pertinent for the assessor to follow up with that organization and say, we need to look more detailed here to make sure that any actions you have taken have been successful, and that we've got to a stage where the process is now operating effectively and running effectively as well. So yes, there is a follow-up from the auditor, and on at least an annual basis, but in some cases it could be more frequently as well. We have a second question here. Does the finding of exceptions automatically mean the issuance of a qualified opinion? Does the finding of exceptions automatically mean the issuance of a qualified opinion? That's an interesting question, because there's two styles of opinion that can come up, that may be noted, which is called an unqualified opinion and a qualified opinion. And it's interesting you try to understand what this actually means and what is considered a qualified or an unqualified report or an opinion. So the answer is, it depends on the exception. So there can be occasions where exceptions are captured and raised and are very severe, are very serious. A perfect example of this is where a process has been documented, but there is no evidence to suggest that process is performing, particularly when you're looking at type 2 and looking at the operating effectiveness. So it could be quite a serious issue. On the other side, there could be exceptions raised that are raised, but the process can still operate. So anyone of an ISO mindset might hear the words observations, minor and major non-conformities, and it's a similar process. So if there are issues that have been raised and there needs to be aspects of a process or a policy or control that need to be improved, that hasn't had a detrimental impact to the wider organization, and this will be the difference between the issuance of a qualified opinion. So if a SOC report, it's probably worth mentioning the unqualified as well. So where a SOC report is issued with a qualified opinion, this basically is an indication that either a single or set of controls have either not been designed, type 1, or operating effectively, thinking of type 2. So if it's a qualified report, those exceptions have been significant enough to deem one or multiple controls to be wholly ineffective. On the other side of the coin, then, an unqualified opinion or an unqualified report indicates that any controls that have been tested, again, either type 1 or type 2 design operating effectively, have been effective. It may be in such a scenario that either there are no issues that have been identified or no exceptions, or there have been some issues, but these issues are not causing that detrimental impact. So it very much depends on the severity of that exception that you determine, is this issuance of a qualified opinion from the auditor or an unqualified. Hope that makes sense. Final question here. I've heard the term bridging letter used before for some companies. What is that? And is it a replacement for a SOC 2 report? Interesting question. So a bridging letter can be used across many companies, and this is basically thinking it as a gap, hence the term bridge. And what this means is the data of the last SOC 2 report that was carried out, and every SOC report will have a clear indication of dates. But there may be a gap between the last SOC report that was carried out and the next SOC report or SOC assessment that's carried out. If there is a significant gap, which typically means any gap 3 months or longer, a letter can be issued that basically is a validation from the company that states we haven't had any changes, any significant changes for our controls that are covered under the purview of our SOC 2 or our SOC 2 that was issued last time. There's been no significant operational or business changes that have affected our controls. So it's a cover point to say this is not a replacement for a SOC 2 report, but it helps to provide that assurance, particularly to clients, if there's a significant gap between SOC 2 to SOC 2 audits. And we do find that often used across many companies, particularly some of the larger companies, the larger multinationals who have had SOC 2 for many years. And through one reason or not, there has been a gap between the two reports. And so, yes, it's that level of assurance which is issued and signed by the organization themselves. So it's not verified by an auditor, but it is delivered from the organization. So it's something that's always worth considering from a client's perspective, from your own perspective, but bearing in mind that, as I say, it hasn't been validated by an auditor. It's simply that organization's response to say, we can confirm there has been no significant change since our last SOC 2 and in preparation for our next scheduled assessment. Okay, see no further questions at the moment. If you do have any more questions following this webinar, do let us know, and I'll be more than happy to provide answers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Thomas, for joining us today and sharing your insight on how to analyze the effectiveness of a vendor's security controls and how to decode third-party SOC 2 reports. We really appreciate all your insight here. And to our audience, we'd love to have you join us for other upcoming OCEG webinars. Please watch out for emails from OCEG regarding these future events. This concludes our webcast today. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone.